Hi, welcome to More Orthodoxy. This is a channel for Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestants alike. Today I'm joined by Mark Buchanan. So let's just begin with a brief introduction to Mark and his work. Usually I do this in my own words, but I find Mark's words a lot more insightful on his website. So he says there, my name is Mark. I'm a writer and a professor. I'm a fisherman and a scuba diver. I love dark rich coffee and lowrider motorcycles. I'm a teacher, a father, an author, a husband, a neighbor, a friend. I'm a worshipper in spirit of truth, a man after God's own heart, and the chief of sinners. I write because I can't help it. It's something viral. The need to write woke up in me when I was 12, and I grew into something fierce and wild and holy. All my books have come from this. They're things birthed, his work was created. I became a pastor because God has a sense of humor. I never intended it, but he saw something in me neither I nor anyone else saw, and drew me down a path that has been the hardest and best of all. I want to die like Jacob, leaning on my staff, worshiping God with all my heart and blessing the generations that come after me. I would like, as my epitaph, he served God in his generation. Especially, I'd like it to be true. Shalom. Marvelous introduction to your work, and I think it speaks to your gifts as a storyteller, which I hope to show people today. So, just with that in mind, then, could we start with a brief introduction to your story by looking at some of the key events in your life, and speak about how those key events impacted you in terms of your feelings and your thoughts? You can choose either an academic or a personal.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. That's a great kind of way to frame this. I think a few of the key events that shaped me, and in ways that I only really came to understand later, is first of all, my father's alcoholism. My father probably became addicted to alcohol when he was 15, and my mother married him with a vague awareness that there might have been a problem. And that problem really erupted early on in their marriage, and very nearly led to their divorce. And a series of kind of what I look back on now as miraculous sort of events happened when I was still too young to even know that my dad had a problem with alcohol. I was maybe 4 at the time. A number of things happened within a very short period where my dad became sober and walked away from alcohol and never touched it again. He'd never had one day of relapse. And my parents' marriage was saved out of that. But more and more as I grew older, I came to realize how formative that, those details of my parents' life and marriage, how much it had a shaping effect, both for good and ill. In some ways, my father's alcoholism was always with us, even though he was clean and sober, and yet it kind of hovered over, shaped kind of the way he was, in ways, again, I didn't understand until much later. But also the ways that my parents made it work, made their marriage work, and I ended up with both parents, loving parents, good parents. And so I see now how much that was a significant thing. The second thing I would highlight is my coming to faith as a young man at 21. And that too had a series of pretty miraculous events around it, where my mother came to faith after she had explored Eastern spirituality for many, many years. And she came to faith when I was about 18. Soon after that, my brother came to faith. And then not long after that, I came to faith. And that really was, I felt, there's this line of from Augustine that T.S. Eliot picks up in his poem, The Wasteland. To Carthage I came, burning, burning, burning. Thou pluckest me, Lord, thou pluckest me burning. That's the T.S. Eliot line from a part of the Confessions. And I felt that I was plucked like a burning shaft from in the hand of God. Very, generations of family members, most of whom didn't name the name of God. And then this series of events that led to my mom's, my brother's, and my conversion. So that would be, and then the third one I would highlight is without any preparation, without any sort of even sensing that this was good, God would call me to. A few years, about 8 years after my conversion, I suddenly found myself in the middle of called into pastoral ministry, and I had not properly prepared for that, or not at all. Had not anticipated that, and that then became this very defining moment that I tried to understand. It took me 10 years to really get my head around that I was a pastor, and that this was, was going to become one of the most formative things in my existence. So those three things I would highlight: my father's alcoholism, but how God seemed to get in the middle of that, a series of conversions in mine when I was 21, and then my coming into pastoral ministry at 29.
Marvelous. So I can see even at a distance through reading your works, the pastoral elements come through, and I think that's one of the most impressive, distinctive features. I'm just wondering, are there any individual works that you've produced that you're particularly proud of, or any significant achievements?
Well, I mean, whenever I think about that, it's not actually the books I've written or any professional accomplishment, though obviously, I've given my heart to those things. And so there is a satisfaction I feel in publishing a book, etc. But it's actually my children. We have 3 children, all grown now, a son who's nearly 30, 2 daughters in their 20s. And I feel such immense joy and the grace of God, because my wife and also a first generation Christian, and so we came to faith at the same time, but neither of us having any kind of background in the Christian faith, no church we attended, all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so looking at how unprepared we were for being Christian parents, and how much the grace of God has been lavished on us. And these kids that now as adults have become dear, dear friends. That to me is a thing that I don't know if I'd say I was proud of it, because I feel that God did many good things in spite of us. But it gives me the most joy.
Marvelous. So this coronavirus, a kind of crisis, has caused a lot of pressure on families. I suppose we're all thrown into an uncomfortable scenario, and maybe a lot of families are used to spending so much time together. But I think one of the ways I see it is like an enforced Sabbath, almost, as kind of a concept in terms, I suppose. But I think one of the themes of your work that appeals to me so much is this focus on Sabbath and the rhythms of time and getting in sync with God's time, which you seem to appreciate more than our current idols, like our time dedicated to the market,
Right.
time dedicated to politics and seeing the world in those terms. Can you tell us what drew you then to the more biblical rhythms of time, and how might we come to appreciate those more in our daily lives?
Right. So what drew me, Mark, was my own haste, my own anxiousness, my own forcing of things and driving of things, and sense of being driven,
Mm-hmm.
and how utterly actually unproductive all of that is in the end. That the thing I was always in a hurry, under the illusion that somehow I would get more done, and the opposite was indeed. I became less creative, less. I even if I produced more, I took no joy in it, and the quality of that which I produced was seriously compromised by the haste. And so I think really my books, and I thank you for pulling out those themes, because it really has been a preoccupation of mine, is what are God's rhythms? How does God keep time? I have a book coming out called Godspeed, and it's really about this. In some ways, one of the titles we played with was Slow God. This God that doesn't move, it doesn't seem in any kind of hurry. And my preoccupation comes from having lived the bulk of my life not attending to those rhythms, and finding that it has not served me at all. And so I think I'm continuously coming back to, why does God move so slowly? and there's a great book by Kosako Koyama, a famous Japanese theologian, called The 3 Mile an Hour God.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's become a deep preoccupation. How do we learn those? Well, I think one of them, I would say two things. One is an honest, almost prophetic critique of our own busyness. Asking ourselves, why am I so busy? What is keeping me in this path of drivenness and busyness that I don't seem to be able to slow down? Why, when I sit down, is my head, are my thoughts racing?
Mm-hmm.
Why this anxiety that constantly plagues me? Fear and anxiety things. Fear is there's a lion or a bear running at you. You ought to be afraid. In other words, fear always has an object or something that is threatening you. Anxiety has no object. Anxiety is free floating. It's sort of the milieu. It's in the air. It's a sense that something's not right, but I can't put my finger on it. And so I think an honest self-evaluation and prophetic critique of our busyness and our anxiousness and saying, why am I in this place? And are there habits that I've picked up that have served it that actually I need to honestly kind of wean myself from those habits.
Mm-hmm.
And the second thing, so that's a negative thing to critique it. The second thing is to actually begin simple practices of quietness, of slowing. That doesn't necessarily mean physical stillness, because some people kinetically aren't wired that way. It means, in fact, I would say, don't even use the word stillness, use the word attentiveness. What would heighten your attentiveness? That you paid more attention to your own sort of emotions, to the people next to you, to the world around you, the ground under you, the air above you, and even to develop, because these things we don't, like any practice, you don't go gung ho. You don't run a marathon in the first try. You work toward it slowly. So of attentiveness that could begin, and referencing a book that I have coming out this summer, this book about walking, Godspeed. This is a perfect time, the coronavirus, we're limited to the kind of exercise we could do. Can't go to a gym. We could drive, but where?
Yeah.
Where we're going? What you can do is walk.
Yeah.
And walking is the premier activity for paying attention to everything, yourself, the person around you. If you live with somebody, or you walk at 6 feet, I guess, and the leaves coming out on the trees, whatever, the birds. So it's a premier act of attentiveness. And I would simply say, start there. Start with a sense of, why am I so busy? Why am I so anxious? Do I need this? Is this helping me? But then what if I began to build in practices of noticing?
Excellent. Definitely speaks to our time, and I can't wait till that book comes out. Ironically enough, I need to wait attentively to focus on those things. But you've written a book similar to some of those themes in some ways. The Rest of God, one of my favorite books, Restoring Your Soul by Restoring Sabbath, which I've actually given to my family members, like bought them copies. I was wondering, because I've taught religious studies, and this Sabbath or Shabbat is always taught within Judaism, but seldom within Christianity, which I think is a terrible shame. Can you describe what the Sabbath is for those who don't know, and what drew you to this supposedly ancient practice, and how have you rediscovered the Sabbath rhythms?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the reasons we don't talk about it much in Christianity is because we've picked up a caricature of the Sabbath from, I think, a very simplistic critique of Judaism, that somehow they're all legalistically bound up in the keeping of Sabbath. And certainly there's some warrant to that critique when we read the Gospels, and all of these, Pharisees and et cetera running around very uptight about, is Jesus breaking the Sabbath because he did this or that. But you don't really begin by understanding something by going to what that thing looks like when it's starting to deteriorate. You go down to the fourth commandment, for instance, or how the Sabbath is woven into the creation story, the God who rests. And you build your theology from these places where we're getting a glimpse of the thing in its pristine, origins. And what we have then is this total gift, extraordinary gift of a generous God who's not a bully God. He's not an anxious God. He's not like the God of the Babylonians who creates by destruction, by destroying, by violence, and makes humankind as his slaves, kind of an afterthought, and to serve his whims. That's the God of the Babylonians. The God of that we meet in the opening page of Scripture is this God who sings, who recites poetry, and things come from it. It is moving it slowly, and there's this, even though the creation sort of happens all in a hurry, there's not a sense of a hurriedness about it, the sense of this thing unfolding. And then the God who, after 6 days of that, says, enough, let's all rest, let's all go have a nap. And so this, and then of course this fourth commandment comes on the heels of 400 plus years of slavery, where people never got to rest. And one of the first items of business after God reintroduces himself, I am the God, I am the God, I am the God, is, oh, and by the way, you should stop working. You need to rest. You need to give everybody a rest. And so I think if we don't frame it as this, we need to frame it as this extraordinary, lavish gift of a very bountiful God who himself is in no rush, and invites us back into our true identity, invites us back into savoring the creation and the gifts he's given. So that's what I would say. And so I think, in my book, The Rest of God, I describe Sabbath as the imitating of God in order to remember we're not God. So the God who rests, but in our busyness, we'll start to fall under the illusion that we somehow have, divine responsibility or divine power. And Sabbath is just stepping back into our childlikeness, our creatureliness, our dependency, our receptivity, and declaring again, I'm not God, but thank God, God is God, and this God is a generous one. So that would be a quick kind of summary of how I think. I came, I discovered it, as I already said at the beginning of this podcast, because I needed it, because I was the most type A, driven, anxious, get it done, strive to prove myself person that ever did dwell on the face of the earth. But none of that was really producing the kind of life or results that I was hoping.
Excellent, thank you, Mark. So kind of an interesting theme that you pull out as well is God's wildness, which people don't really seem to appreciate as much. You distinguish God's goodness from the safe God that we're more familiar with. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, I do think, and increasingly, actually, Mark, I'm working on a novel right now where one of the key themes is a connection between God's goodness and his wildness, his untamability. The Narnia stories have shaped me deeply. Is that an Irish accent you have?
Yeah.
So of course, Lewis was an Irishman living, on Hollywood near Belfast, and the landscape so shaped his vision of Narnia. I've spent much time in parts of Northern Ireland, and I've sort of drunk deeply of that kind of landscape. It's so lovely and so green and so wild. But the Aslan character in the Narnia Chronicles is he's not safe, but he's good. He's a wild creature, but his wildness and his goodness are bound up together. Mm-hmm. And I have been so profoundly influenced by that, and more that sense grows. I live near the Rocky Mountains. I'm often out there hiking. They tell you, do not go out there without bear spray, because there's these massive grizzly bears that would eat you without blinking. And often, I've not seen one face to face out there, but I've seen many wild things, bighorn sheep and beautiful elk and wolves and etc. And there's something about seeing the face of a wild thing that's like seeing the face of God, that it is this untamable quality. And yet with God, there's this God who chooses the role of a servant. The wild thing, the lion who becomes the lamb who is slain. This extraordinary story.
Mhm.
And so I do, that vision that John has of, I looked and there was, there's a lion on the throne, and then I looked and it was a lamb who was slain, right? We'll pick. well, yes, it's both. And so I've been so drawn to that kind of understanding, partly because I do think that in many ways in Christianity, we have, our impulse has always been toward domestication of faith, domestication of God, domestication of the Holy Spirit, domestication of church, domestication of what it is to be a saint. I think even the dumbing down of that. I think of the great Camus novel, The Plague, where one of the key characters says near the end of it, the only real goal in life is to become a saint. And there's a sense where that's me, that's my theology. But the saint is not this sort of austere, pale, dour creature, but this person that you don't have categories for,
Mhm.
that their humanity has become so what God envisioned it would be. There's no way of actually putting that person in a box. So yeah, that is, I don't know if I've even answered your question other than say, I've gone on rhapsodically about wildness and all that, but I really do long for some recovery of the sense of the God who's not safe. That's actually my very first book. Your God is too safe.
Mhm. Marvelous. So you contrast this with the modern focus on the self and this whole myth of the unknown self
Right.
be true, which I think what you're saying is a lot more interesting, a lot more faithful to what the Bible lays out about the self, and we can't really know ourselves apart from God, if that makes sense. What do you think some of the key problems with our modern focus on the self are?
Well, I think I'm just not large enough. I'm not, my inner life isn't rich enough for me to make the focus of my life. I mean, it's interesting that in evangelical Christianity, we talk about salvation as inviting Jesus into my life. Well, actually, that's not very biblical language. What we see in Scripture is Jesus keeps inviting us into His life.
Mhm.
And that to me is a much more intriguing proposition, because the idea that I'm going to invite Jesus into my life, well, that's exactly, I think, why our faith and Christianity in large part in the modern world has become so domesticated, is that my life just isn't that big or interesting. And Jesus doesn't have a lot to do. It's like, the story of the disciples who, take Jesus on the boat and he falls asleep. Well, they do their stuff and then finally have to wake him up because there's a storm even they can't handle. And there's a sense where inviting Jesus in my life is like inviting him into my little world that I control, that I just want him to go over there and be quiet. But I really think that the biggest problem with this sort of me-centeredness is I am not that interesting. And Jesus invited me into something far more wild and dangerous and bigger than that. But the other thing is, like that you quoted the Shakespeare thing, to thy own self be true. And that seems to be in some ways the dominant kind of philosophy of the moment. And we see, follow your bliss or whatever the various phrases are. I mean, again, the problem is not only am I not that interesting, but some of that goes on in me all the time, every day I wake up to it. If I am true to that, my marriage is over. I've lost my friends. There's so many impulses that work in me, Mark, that are so destructive to everything that actually is good and beautiful in my life, that I actually have to get up every day and not be true to myself,
Yeah.
to say no to myself. Obviously, there's parts of me that are kind and virtuous, and what's that that famous line by Abraham Lincoln? I summon the angels of my better nature, etc. Yeah, there is parts of me that I need to be true to, but I think most listeners, whether they're Christian or not, would have to say, yeah, there's parts of me that I like, and I think they do. It's lucky world that when I'm walking in that particular habit or attitude, that gets loosed in the world. But there's other parts that every person listening would say, yeah, you're right. There's parts of me that if I don't kind of declare war on, if I don't kind of say a defiant no to, nobody wins. I don't win, spouse doesn't win, kids don't win, neighbors don't win. So I got to just shut that one down. And so that would be, my critique. I think God loves people. Obviously, He loves personality. He made all these weird ones. I think God is a great lover of who we are, but He's also he's wanting to loose us, release us, not us to sort of choose some version of ourselves that is less than what we could be.
Excellent. Kind of paired to that more interesting view of God, which I think is the more biblical view. You move away from more abstract arguments and touch people where they are, and it kind of speaks to the problems that they have, problems of evil and all these kind of existential questions. You draw upon biblical characters like Habakkuk. Can you speak to that a little bit? What draws you to characters like that, and why do you think they're so important?
Well, Habakkuk is really having having it out with God, a real sort of throw down fight with God about God's justice and whatnot. And so that actually fits with a lot of biblical themes. It's Moses having a showdown with God, on the mountain where God wants to kill everybody, and Moses having none of it.
Mm-hmm.
Or when Moses is like, kill me, like I can't stand this job anymore. Or Abraham outside of Sodom having a conversation with God about with the King of Righteousness not do right. And so there's this deep theme running through Scripture that gets embodied in actual stories and characters of people who deal with God with a kind of frankness and an audacity that is profoundly appealing to me, because I do think that God invites us into this relationship that is not tippy-toey, it's not kid-gloved. I remember once when I was a pastor, I'm now a professor, but I did pastor for many years, and somebody saying, well, they were going through some horrific thing in their life, and they said to me, but I know that if I trust God, I'll not ask Him why. And I said, say again? I said, if your neighbor down the street who you didn't know was acting in a bizarre way, you might wonder what they're up to, but you wouldn't go ask them why. You don't know the neighbor well enough. If it was your husband, you would ask, what are you doing? Intimacy implies the right to know, at least the right to ask.
Mm-hmm.
So if the more intimate I am with a person, the more I've sort of earned in the relationship this right to have it out, in a sense, to have a frank conversation about what just happened here. And I see that that's exactly how biblical relationship is defined and worked out with God. So I see that in Habakkuk, that there's a sense of working out the actual mess of reality and injustice and whatnot with a God who sometimes answers, sometimes doesn't, but is up for the conversation. And that to me is, again, a factor of what we talked about earlier, this wild God who we can't control and we can't predict, and yet we are in relationship with. And part of that is stepping into this messy relationship that we have with Him, and asking the hard questions, whether we get an answer. And Job does that. his friends keep telling him to shut up. You should say nice Orthodox things about God. And Job's like, I'm having none of that. I want him showing up here and giving me an explanation. God shows up what? In wildness.
Yeah.
Whirlwind and have you seen hippos? Hippos are amazing and all this stuff. And finally, God doesn't give Job an answer. He doesn't say, well, this is what I'm up to. But there's something profoundly satisfying, Job, because he says, now my eyes have seen.
Mm-hmm.
I got a face-to-face. That's really all I wanted.
Yeah.
So, Mark, something about that, and I guess you're hearing, this theme that is part of also my concern, is this God with whom we have to do, who isn't this meek and mild God. He's wild, as Mr. Beaver says of Aslan.
Excellent. I think also you correct some of the stereotypes of things like God's wrath. Can you explain that a little bit and why you think that's important?
Yeah, very, very much. I mean, I do think that one of the things that has happened is some of the debates we've seen throughout history, but certainly these have resurfaced recently about the nature of God, and do we lean, into the love of God, the grace of God, or into the justice of God, the sovereignty of God, etc. And these things have always kind of had their days and their debaters within history, but they're sort of at a fairly sharp point right now. And I would say that often I hear people talk about the love of God, and that would be where I would actually lean more toward the love of God, the grace of God, this wild grace of God. But I do think that sometimes I hear others talk about that, and it seems like they've forgotten this God who can get mad, can be really annoyed with you, can sort of gets insulted and does destructive things as a consequence. So, if you read the prophets just a little bit, it'll attune you to this God who's wild, but sometimes his wildness comes away as I'm going to, bring all the wrath that I have against that people. And sometimes it's his own people. So we have to deal with that honestly. And this also emerges in the New Testament, not like it goes away in the teachings of Jesus or the church. What I have wrestled with is, which do we default to? I honestly think in the end, we have to make a choice of what is the fundamental nature and character of God. Is he a God of love, as John says God is love, or is he a God of wrath or justice, or however you want to portray that? And I would argue, and it would take much longer, and I won't take the time to sort of mount the biblical argument, that the fundamental portrait of God is a God of love. So here's the thing: if your fundamental part of God is a God of justice or wrath, then you have to account for all the loving bits. Why is God loving? And, I say a Calvinist position, well, he's loving toward the ones he picked, right? The chosen. Or you say the fundamental nature of God is love. So what do we do with the angry bits? What do we do with this God who's on the rampage? So one way or another, you have to come up with what is the fundamental nature of God, and then how do I account for that bit that doesn't seem to fit? Well, I choose that God is love, but I have to deal with the anger, the wrath, this God who sometimes will not be talked down. Well, how do I understand that? Well, I have to understand that as somehow an extension and reflection of his love. And in one of my books, I think it's The Holy Wild, I discuss, I have a whole chapter on the wrath of God, and I talk specifically about a time when my father, who I talked about my father's, my relationship a little bit at the beginning of the program. But I wondered, he wasn't forthwith, he wasn't demonstrative in his affection, his love. The first time I really knew my father loved me was when I saw his wrath. And it was wrath on my behalf toward a bully neighbor who was hanging and licking on me and had thrown me off my bike and was beating me up. And suddenly I saw to my wondering eyes this bully being lifted, physically from me. And then my father, in ways that probably would have got him landed in jail at this time. But my father just really kind of taken at this bully and making him suffer for what he had done to his son. And I remember, Mark, I knew in an instant my father loved me. I knew that wrath was a sign of his deep, deep love for me, his protective love for me. And so I use that story to kind of explore this theme of wrath. And I think in the end that we have to again default is the fundamental nature of God wrath, or is it love? And I would say love. But the way I've come to understand wrath is it's always going to be the dark side of that love. It's always going to be somehow the expression, the working out of the deep love that God has for that which he's made, and that's what he's committed to.
Marvelous. That story really brought it home to me in the book, and I thought that was amazing. Um, just next, if we might go to the book Spiritual Rhythm.
Right.
Jesus, every season of your soul. So this is really intriguing because usually we hear of the seasons of your life maybe in chronological order.
Right.
Make it a lot more interesting, and you change things a little bit. Can you tell us a bit about that book and what's distinct about it?
Yeah. So the book is about the seasons that don't move in chronological order, the seasons of the soul or the heart, where an 18-year-old can be in a winter season where everything seems bleak and dark and fruitless. An 83-year-old can be in a season of summertime where it just seems like, wow, everything's so bright and warm and good, and all that lies in between. So I got very interested in that because of a personal loss of a dear friend and colleague that died. And for the first time in my life, and this is when I was in my 30s, or 40s rather, I really plunged into a deep winter where I had no motivation, and it seemed very cold, and it seemed very bleak, and nothing seemed to grow, and et cetera, et cetera. And I began to understand, first of all, that this is a winter time. There wasn't much I could do to change it, but it was a winter of the soul. Then the other insight I joined to that is that Jesus' main measure of are you belong to me, are you growing in me, is fruit. And fruit implies seasons. So fruit grows seasonally. Even in tropical countries that seem to be devoid of seasons, you're still going to have the season of pineapples or whatever. But certainly in the northern hemispheres where people like you and I live, Mark, we watch the whole cycle of the seasons, and how only in one season do we have fruit, and actually only in a little fraction of that season do we have fruit. Even most of that season that grows fruit, summer, is for the kind of the kind of nurturing and the sweetening up of the fruit. And so the insight that I sort of say is, if Jesus says we need to bear fruit, and fruit happens in seasons. In fact, it happens within this very narrow window of a season, but all of the seasons are necessary cycles in the production of that fruit. Isn't it maybe then makes sense that all of these cycles or seasons of the soul, the winter, the fall, etc., are part of our formation, a necessary part of our formation. So that's kind of the premise I began with, and then it began to examine and explore in the book. What would those seasons feel like, look like? What would be the hallmarks of them? How might we steward each of them? What do you do, not do in any given season? Is there any way you prolong a season if you want, like a summer? Is there any way you can foreshorten a season like a winter? All of that explore. That's the first part of the book. The second part is more about this sort of concept of rhythm, of working through and moving through our life in a rhythmic way. But that's the basic idea, and it was helpful to me personally, but also pastorally, because I realized that in any given time in, say, a faith community, probably a quarter to a third of the people are experiencing some kind of winter, and often feeling like they're failures, that say they've somehow this is some mistake they've made, some sin they've committed, God walked away, they walked away, whatever. And not that there can't be real times where we've rebelled and things go very dark, but when I began to understand, no, sometimes this is just part of how our souls kind of respond to seasons of life or things that go on. That was very helpful for me pastorally. I think I began to preach better
Excellent.
after experiencing my own winter. Yeah.
It's been helpful for me too, so thank you for that.
You're welcome.
I would love to go through all of your books, but I guess we'll not keep you all evening. If we might, I would like to discuss. Recently, you've written a book about David, right?
Right.
And it's a novel. Why did you think it was
Yeah.
important to write a novel about David in particular?
Well, if I, was going to give myself the title scholar on anything, it would maybe be a David scholar, but that would be too pretentious. I'm not, but I've done enormous amounts of study. I teach a full credit course on the life of David, so I really have immersed myself in that story and the literature around that story, and knew at some point I was going to turn my pen to writing about David, but I didn't have it in me for whatever reason to write a leadership book, leadership principles from David or anything like that. I began as a fiction writer, Mark. Maybe I should say that the books that you're familiar with are nonfiction, but my early formation as a writer was as a fiction writer, and love to tell stories. That I think comes up in that's fairly evident in my writing. And I thought, what do we need another book about another commentary on David? No. Do we need another leadership book on? No. I mean, at least I didn't feel I could contribute significantly to that body of work. What do we need? And I thought, well, when I sat with the David story, I had so many questions with the story as it comes to us that really were questions that are for a novelist. I wondered when Saul says, okay, you can go fight that giant, knowing that the stakes are whoever wins, becomes a slave of the other. And Saul lets David go out with a slingshot, and then doesn't seem to recognize him at all, even though David's been serving him as an armor bearer and as a musician. So we could either account for those discrepancies, by that boring theory of source criticism, or we could say, here's the story with all of its weird little kind of these inexplicable bits. It invited a kind of a novelistic reimagining what was going on. So that was one of my favorite scenes to write in the book, the scene where David comes into the tent of Saul, and Saul finally lets him loose to go fight the giant. What's going on there, the dynamics of that relationship, the dynamics of that conversation. So it seemed to me all through the David story, there's these moments. I do a lot with the story of David and his first wife, Michal, who's the daughter of Saul. And there's so many, she's smitten with him. She's wild in love with him. She defies her own father to help him, and he seems to not really care about her. And so I began to think and walk and imaginatively enter into that. And finally, a novel began to sort of take shape around it. And what I've done is released this book in March, came out, David Rise. It's actually book one of a proposed trilogy. I'm planning to write two more to cover the story of David. And at the heart of that book also, I mean, one of the things that in a novel that's different from a biblical story in the main, so even as interesting as a biblical story in 1st and 2nd Samuel is, it comes to us about David, there's an agenda, in terms of the biblical writers and writing that story. There's an agenda primarily. There's probably lots of agendas, but one of them is it's written for a later generation to demonstrate that Saul or David had no hand in the death and the murder of Saul and his family. That's part of it's just clearly one of the agendas of the writing of that text. Vindicate David from any kind of blood guilt. Well, that's not that interesting as a novel premise, to be honest. What's interesting is what is actually driving David. That's always underneath a novel. What's driving these characters? Why are they doing this? What do they want? And I think what David wants, and I think it's present in the story, but not the main concern in the biblical story, but what David wants is the love of the Father. He wants it from Jesse. He wants it from Saul. I think his friendship from Jonathan, who's probably older than him, probably significantly older, is actually a quest for father love. He's himself stalled out in giving father love or proper father love to his own sons and daughters. I think it's a father love story. And so if I write the David narrative around that deep quest that David himself is only partly in tune with, but it becomes evident more and more as you read that actually what's driving this guy is he wants the love of the Father. Well, it just suddenly the Psalms start to make a ton more sense in that context. David actually has difficulty, and this emerges from the historical story, the biblical story, connecting with people. He draws people, he fascinates people, he wins the allegiance of people. People divide over him, but we never have a sense that David has, other than Jonathan, a real friend in the earth. He's not great with his wives. He's not great with his kids. He seems like actually at the very end a very lonely and isolated man. Mm-hmm. So there's this part of David that his humanity seems somehow stifled by something, and yet his relationship with God is unbelievable. So you read the Psalms and you think, this guy knew intimacy, but he didn't know intimacy with his wives, his mm-hmm. kids, his buddies. So that is interesting to me. And I think that another, again, what would account for that? What I think if there is a quest in David's life that was only partly fulfilled is this longing for the love of the Father. He never got it from Jesse. He never got it from Saul. I think he found it in God, but I think that he awaits it. I mean, part of, I think, the story of David that makes it so powerful, Mark, is in the end, it's not a story of a hero. It's a story of a man who, like you and I, needs God as desperately as you and I need God. That's a good story.
Wonderful. I'm looking forward to the trilogy, and I'm sure other people will be too.
Thank you.
Are there any other books that you are planning to release? So you've mentioned Godspeed.
Yeah, so I have Godspeed coming out in July, and it's about walking. It's called Walking as a Spiritual Practice, and it really explores the many dimensions, physical, spiritual, emotional, relational, around walking. And just a quick word about that. I began to think, why did the most incarnational religion or faith in the world, Christianity, which says the word becomes flesh and walks among us, why don't we have a corresponding physiology? Why don't we have like yoga? And I realized actually we do. We've always had one. It's called walking. And so that was the seed of the book. And so I began to explore that and realized there's actually enough, there's 250 pages of something to say about this. So I actually really like the book. It's my first, the David book came out in March. This is coming out in July. And my previous last book was 8 years ago, Your Church is Too Safe. So it feels like a good book these both book feels like good books to sort of come back with. I'm working on 2 other books right now. I hope to have them both complete by the summer in terms of their first draft. One is another novel on called The Slide, and it's about a pastor who gets to being a pastor for all the wrong reasons and totally messes up his life. And then through a series of mostly teachers he meets on the way, really odd assortment of people, begins to really understand who God is. So that's called The Slide. And then another book called Shelter Me. And it's based on a historical event that happened in France during the war in a little community that is famous called Le Chambon, that under the direction of a pastor by the name of André Tocquemé, they ended up saving many, many people, mostly Jews, And the estimate is anywhere between 2,500 and some have estimated as high as 8,000. It's probably maybe around 4,000, but nobody has fixed numbers. But years ago, I became interested. I was actually living in that little village, Le Chambon, and I had to come home because of the pandemic. But the story is sort of a novel that has many moving pieces to it, and explores kind of this, at the heart of it is this pastor and his vision to begin to rescue people who lives are imperiled during this very dark time in our history.
Well, very exciting to hear that you're still producing some great work. Before we go then, I was wondering, this is a question that might throw you off a bit, it's throwing a few people off. What is that you'd like your legacy to be at a personal and academic level?
Yeah, I've tried to write books that are more timeless than timely. So I would love to think that some of the books, I doubt all of them, but I'd like to think that a few of them would have a kind of a life beyond me. But I actually don't have much invested in that, Mark. I actually would love my legacy to be the generations that come after me who love the Lord. I came from the generations that didn't. I was the first, and my wife, first generation really of Christ followers. And we both hold that promise that the thousands who will love the Lord that will come on after us. And I cherish that notion that my children and my children's children all down the line, that they're just these great generations of those who love and serve the Lord.
Amazing, God willing, and thank God for that. So thank you very much for your time, Mark. I greatly appreciate it. It's been a pleasure. Anybody listening, I'll link some of your work in the description below for YouTube, and they can follow up. You can go to your website, and I'm sure they'll be thrilled to read about David and some of those other books that you have coming out. And I definitely recommend some of those books and more that we haven't got through today. So I wish you all the best, and God bless you.
Thank you. Thanks for this great interview.